In this episode of American Greed, we peel back the glossy layers of a billionaire banker who sold the dream of wealth, but delivered a nightmare. This is the story of Allen Stanford, the man who built a financial empire on lies, charm, and one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history. It all started in the Caribbean, Antigua to be exact, a tiny island, beautiful beaches, and the headquarters of Allen Stanford's offshore bank. He was charming, tall, confident, always dressed in a crisp white suit with a billionaire's swagger. And most importantly, he sold trust. Through his company, Stanford Financial Group, he promised clients sky-high returns through certificates of deposit, or CDs, offered through his Stanford International Bank in Antigua. Investors poured in billions. The elite trusted him. Even the SEC didn't see it coming, at first. Stanford claimed those CDs were backed by safe, high-performing investments. But in reality, there were no real investments. It was all a show, a house of cards built on fake account statements, fake returns, and money being shuffled from one client to pay another. This wasn't just deception. It was a $7 billion Ponzi scheme, one of the largest the U.S. had ever seen. Stanford used investors' money to fund his lavish lifestyle. Private jets, luxury yachts, cricket tournaments, and massive donations that bought him power and influence. To the world, he was a philanthropist. To his inner circle, he was the boss. But behind the curtains, everything was about to fall apart. In 2009, after years of growing suspicion, the SEC finally closed in. A former employee had leaked critical documents. Whistleblowers were ignored for years until they weren't. Stanford was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. Agents raided his offices. Clients were devastated. Thousands of retirees, business owners, and everyday investors had lost everything. Some would never recover. Lives were ruined, savings gone, and yet Stanford showed no remorse. He called it a witch hunt. He said the government was after him, but the evidence? Overwhelming. In 2012, Allen Stanford was convicted on 13 counts and sentenced to 110 years in prison. The courtroom was packed. Victims wept, and the billionaire who once stood above it all was now inmate number 35,017-183. What made it so twisted was how personal it felt. He didn't just steal money, he shattered dreams. He sold security to those who trusted him most, and walked away smiling until the very end. Allen Stanford is now a forgotten name to most. But for those he deceived, the pain is still very real. The warning is clear. Not all criminals wear masks. Some wear suits. Some smile. And some promise you the world while quietly pulling the rug from under your feet. Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in. If you're here for the first time, welcome. I'm so glad you found us. And if you're returning, welcome back. I'm Suada Conzonire, your host, and this is American Greed, a special edition of Suada's Crime Files. Once a month, we shine a spotlight on the masterminds of financial crime, the people who didn't need a weapon to destroy lives. They used charm, lies, paper trails, and sometimes silence. But their damage? Devastating. This series is about more than just the crimes. It's about the psychology, the pressure points, and the human cost of unchecked greed. My goal here is simple: to tell the stories that matter, expose the deception, and learn the warning signs so it doesn't happen again. This isn't just crime. It's a mirror to power, trust, and ambition gone wrong. Today's story, it's about a man who styled himself as a billionaire banker, a philanthropist, a financial genius, and fooled regulators, investors, and governments alike. He built a global empire, lavish offices, private jets, celebrity endorsements, but behind the polished image was a pyramid built on pure fiction. And joining me today is retired FBI agent Greg Thompson, a veteran of financial crime investigations, who was there as the walls around this empire began to crumble. Greg, welcome back to the show. This one's a monster.
It really is, Suada. Allen Stanford pulled off one of the most audacious frauds since Madoff, and somehow managed to keep it going for over 2 decades. It's a case that stunned even seasoned investigators.
Before the billion-dollar fraud, before the headlines, before the prison sentence, he was just Allen Stanford. Born March 24, 1950 in Mexia, Texas, Robert Allen Stanford was raised in a modest, conservative household in a small town best known for its Southern traditions and slower pace of life. His father, James Stanford, owned an insurance company. It was a stable, middle-class upbringing, nothing flashy, but with the right mix of discipline and ambition.
Yeah, and what stood out even then was Allen's hunger to stand out. He wasn't the most brilliant student, but he had charm, he had presence, he had drive. He graduated from Baylor University in Waco, Texas, with a degree in finance. But it wasn't just about education. It was about elevation. He wanted more.
After college, Stanford briefly entered the insurance business, following in his father's footsteps, but something shifted in him. The boy from Mexia wasn't satisfied with being just comfortable. He wanted wealth, recognition, status, and he didn't care how he got there. In the late 1980s, Stanford moved his operations to the Caribbean, setting up the Stanford International Bank in the island nation of Montserrat, and eventually shifting to Antigua. Why? Because the rules were looser, oversight was thin, and offshore banking offered exactly the kind of opaque environment he needed.
Let's not forget, Stanford styled himself as a billionaire philanthropist. He wore crisp suits, built cricket stadiums, rubbed shoulders with presidents. He even got knighted by the Antiguan government. But beneath that polished image, he was quietly operating one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history.
Married once but divorced, Stanford was known for his playboy lifestyle, private jets, luxury yachts, and multiple girlfriends. He claimed to be worth over $2 billion. He wasn't just running a business. He was selling a dream, and he sold it well. But dreams built on deception eventually collapse, and Allen Stanford's world, it was about to come crashing down. If Allen Stanford had one talent, it was packaging lies in luxury. From the outside, the Stanford Financial Group looked like a fortress of wealth and trust. Offices in Houston, Miami, London, Venezuela, and Switzerland. Staff in Armani suits, polished mahogany desks, and a leader who walked like royalty.
He built a brand around exclusivity and elite service. His clients weren't just customers, they were hand-picked investors. That was part of the illusion. You weren't giving money to some Wall Street shark, you were joining an elite club.
At the center of this empire was the Stanford International Bank, headquartered on the Caribbean island of Antigua. From there, Stanford sold what he called certificates of deposit, CDs with returns that sounded too good to be true, because they were.
He promised 8 to 10% annual returns, consistently, rain or shine. Even during financial downturns, Stanford's bank claimed it never took a hit, and clients believed him. They believed the private jet, the custom cigar line, the sports sponsorships, the charity galas. The lifestyle made it all look real.
And he backed it with smooth-talking sales reps, over 100 of them, trained to sell the fantasy. These were smart, polished professionals convincing retirees, doctors, and small business owners to invest their life savings offshore.
They handed over their money, thinking it was being diversified into low-risk, high-return assets. But the truth? Stanford was using new investors' money to pay off older ones. Classic Ponzi playbook.
And Stanford? He was thriving. In 2008, he claimed his personal fortune exceeded $2 billion. He was living in a $10 million Houston mansion, flying in and out of his private hangars, and rubbing elbows with celebrities and heads of state.
But there was no real portfolio behind those CDs. No high-return assets. It was smoke, mirrors, and a whole lot of charm.
Still, for nearly 2 decades, no one questioned the setup. Not the clients, not the regulators, not even Wall Street. But when the 2008 financial crisis hit and the money stopped flowing in, Stanford's pristine image began to crack, and investigators started asking the right questions. Every empire built on lies eventually starts to wobble. For Allen Stanford, the cracks didn't come with a bang, but with whispers.
By late 2008, Stanford's name was still gold-plated, but insiders were getting nervous. Investment advisors began questioning why his returns were so steady, almost too steady. The global markets were in free fall, yet his CDs remained untouched. That didn't add up.
And remember, we were in the middle of a financial crisis. Bernie Madoff had just been arrested. Suddenly, too good to be true was sounding more like too dangerous to ignore.
The Securities and Exchange Commission had already received complaints about Stanford, but it wasn't until 2009 that those whispers turned into a formal investigation.
In February of that year, the SEC finally made its move. The complaint? That Stanford had orchestrated a massive Ponzi scheme, bilking investors out of over $7 billion.
And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Regulators froze his assets, raided his offices, and shut down the Stanford Financial Group. Employees were blindsided. Investors were panicked. And Allen Stanford? He vanished.
He fled to Virginia, hid out in his girlfriend's home. For days he was on the run. No charges yet, but the heat was coming. And then, in June 2009, the U.S. Marshals finally caught up with him.
He was arrested and indicted on 21 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. Prosecutors said it was the second largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history, right behind Madoff.
But what stunned the world wasn't just the size of the fraud. It was how long he got away with it. Over 20 years of deception, billions lost, thousands of lives shattered. The king of offshore banking was finally cornered, and as investigators peeled back the layers, they uncovered just how deep the corruption went. Allen Stanford may have been the face of the fraud, but no one pulls off a $7 billion Ponzi scheme alone. Behind every great con is a web of enablers, people who helped build it, protect it, and profit from it.
Stanford surrounded himself with loyalty, not necessarily talent. People who wouldn't ask questions, people who'd follow orders. That was the real strategy.
One of those key figures was James Davis, the chief financial officer of Stanford Financial Group, and Stanford's college roommate. Davis later admitted he had known about the fraud for years, and said he went along with it out of fear and loyalty.
Davis even testified that they had secret code words, that Stanford called the entire scheme the family business. They fabricated documents, made fake investment reports, and funneled money to make it look legitimate.
And then there was Laura Pendergast Holt, the chief investment officer. When the SEC began closing in, she was trotted out to testify, but under questioning she fumbled, couldn't explain basic details of the firm's assets. That raised more than eyebrows. It confirmed suspicions.
Holt was eventually charged with obstruction and conspiracy. She pled guilty in 2013. Her cooperation helped prosecutors paint a clearer picture of just how many people were in on it, or willing to look the other way.
And the victims? They weren't just random investors. Stanford's CDs were marketed through a network of brokers and financial advisors who, in many cases, knew the risks, but took the commissions anyway.
Some of those advisors earned six figures annually just from commissions off Stanford CDs. When the SEC questioned them, many claimed they had no idea, but the paper trail suggested otherwise.
This wasn't just one man gone rogue. It was a tightly spun web of complicity, of people blinded by money, status, and fear. And in the end, every one of them played a part in the collapse. Behind every dollar stolen, there's a person, a life, a dream. And when Allen Stanford's empire collapsed, so did the financial futures of tens of thousands across the globe.
The victims were everywhere: Florida, Venezuela, Mexico, Antigua. He didn't just target the wealthy, he targeted anyone who believed in security: retirees, single mothers, teachers. Many invested their entire life savings.
Let's take Venezuela, for instance. Some victims there were told these CDs were as safe as a Swiss bank account. They were marketed as conservative, stable, insured, even though they were anything but.
And in Antigua, it was even more complex. Stanford had embedded himself into the island's economy. He was seen as a philanthropist. He funded schools, cricket stadiums, charities, but all of that, it was a smokescreen.
He became almost untouchable. People called him a savior. Local leaders praised him, but beneath that image was a financial predator, bleeding their wealth dry to maintain his illusion of grandeur.
One woman from Louisiana invested her $200,000 retirement fund after attending a Stanford seminar. She thought she was buying security. Instead, she spent her golden years in bankruptcy.
Another family lost their home after cashing out a college fund to buy into Stanford's guaranteed investments. Their son never made it to university. Their trust was weaponized against them.
And we're not just talking about financial ruin. The emotional toll was staggering. Suicides, mental health crises, marriages destroyed. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were lives, forever altered.
Allen Stanford wore the mask of a benefactor, but what he took can't be measured in dollars. It was security, dignity, hope, and that, perhaps more than anything else, is the true cost of greed. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from across the globe filled the benches. And sitting in the center of it all, no longer dressed in tailored suits or island whites, was Allen Stanford. In a prison-issued jumpsuit, his empire reduced to ash.
By the time the trial began in January 2012, Stanford had spent nearly 3 years in custody. He had claimed injuries from a jailhouse fight and even tried to declare himself mentally incompetent to stand trial. But the judge wasn't buying it.
He was facing 14 counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. The prosecution laid out a blistering case with over 100 witnesses and thousands of documents that revealed exactly how Stanford operated.
It was methodical. They showed how Stanford's bank in Antigua was just a vault for lies. They exposed the phony audits, the fabricated records, and the shell corporations. Stanford was essentially playing God with other people's money.
And then came James Davis, Stanford's former CFO. Once loyal, now the prosecution's star witness. He testified that Stanford had knowingly operated the investment program as a Ponzi scheme for nearly 2 decades.
His testimony was devastating. Davis described meetings where Stanford coached staff on how to dodge regulators, how to lie to investors, and how to cover their tracks with layers of deception.
Stanford, for his part, claimed he was innocent. He said the business collapsed due to government interference and called himself a scapegoat. But the jury didn't buy it.
In March 2012, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Allen Stanford guilty on 13 of 14 counts. And in June, the judge handed down the sentence, 110 years in federal prison.
110 years. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a message to every white-collar criminal who believes a polished smile and offshore account can shield them from justice.
And even then, for the victims, it wasn't closure. The money was gone, the pain remained. But finally, there was accountability.
It's easy to look at Allen Stanford and just see a fraudster, a liar, a manipulator. But what compels a man, already wealthy, already powerful, to chase more? What flips ambition into obsession?
In my years with the Bureau, I saw one recurring pattern in white-collar crime: entitlement. Allen Stanford didn't just want to succeed. He believed he deserved to succeed more than anyone else, that the rules didn't apply to him.
He wasn't stealing to survive. He was stealing to be worshipped. This was a man who wanted to be treated like a king, literally. He built a cricket stadium in Antigua and named it after himself. He traveled with armed guards, flew in private jets, sipped fine cognac.
He even had his own branded currency, Stanford dollars, for use on his island properties. That's not finance, that's fantasy. He saw himself as an untouchable figure, almost mythic.
And what about his victims? How did he sleep at night?
He rationalized. That's another classic trait. He told himself he was creating wealth, doing good. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, he knew the empire was rotting from within. But in his mind, the illusion was more valuable than truth.
That kind of delusion takes time to build. Stanford wasn't impulsive. He was meticulous, controlled. He didn't just build a Ponzi scheme. He built a persona, and then got lost inside it.
By the time it all came crashing down, I don't think he even saw himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a fallen king, a victim of jealousy, not justice.
And that's the most dangerous kind of greed, the kind that looks in the mirror and sees a hero. The fall of Allen Stanford wasn't just the end of a Ponzi scheme. It was the unraveling of lives, dreams, and entire communities. Over 18,000 investors lost a collective $7 billion. Retirements were destroyed, homes were lost, trust shattered.
And unlike Bernie Madoff, whose investors were largely from Wall Street, Stanford's victims were everyday people. Retirees, nurses, teachers. Many were from Latin America and the Caribbean, where his presence felt more like a sovereign than a CEO.
Antigua, where his empire was based, was hit especially hard. Stanford had become an economic pillar there, sponsoring sports, building infrastructure, providing jobs. His collapse sent the island into a tailspin.
Allen Stanford, I think he's the largest investor in Antigua. He employs a lot of people. They in turn pay a lot of taxes to the government, and it will affect a lot of people.
US authorities have charged the Antigua-based billionaire with fraud, and they're starting to freeze his assets. In Antigua, that means hundreds of people could soon be out of a job. The Texan financier was by far the island's biggest private investor. The extent of Allen Stanford's influence over Antigua's economy can be seen from a quick walk around the airport grounds. He owns 6 or 7 properties in this compound alone, including an investment company, a national newspaper, and even a multi-million-dollar cricket ground.
He is a big employer in the country, and there are hundreds and thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on the success and the continuance of his businesses. So I'm very concerned about those individuals and the long-term effects on the Antiguan economy.
There were protests in the streets. Small investors lost everything. Even Antiguan regulators and local politicians were accused of looking the other way. The island's financial credibility took a global hit.
And what about restitution?
It's ongoing. Victims have received only a fraction of what they lost, around 5 cents on the dollar. The legal battle over asset recovery continues more than a decade later.
Allen Stanford got a life prison sentence. He's at a federal penitentiary in Florida, but from there, acting as his own attorney, he is single-handedly blocking the biggest potential source of recovery for the victims. It's a $1.3 billion settlement with 3 of the banks who are accused of helping him.
He has nothing else to do right now. His cause célèbre is trying to make his case for the courts, ignoring the fact that what he's doing is denying victims' recoveries.
If that bank settlement eventually does come through, and it still could be months away, it would basically double the recovery for Stanford victims, but it's still not much. Right now, they've recovered about 25 cents on the dollar. It would go up to about 46 cents with that recovery. But you compare that to the victims of the Madoff scandal, who, as you indicated, Brian, have gotten back about 75 cents on the dollar and counting. This is something that the victims and the receiver are, as you can imagine, not happy about.
And the SEC, the Justice Department?
They faced criticism too, especially for not acting sooner. There were red flags in the early 2000s. Whistleblowers spoke up. But the scale of Stanford's deception, combined with the complexity of offshore banking, made prosecutions slow and difficult.
Allen Stanford is now serving 110 years at USP Coleman in Florida. He will die behind bars. But his legacy, his real legacy, is the warning he leaves behind, that sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear custom suits, not ski masks.
And they don't just rob vaults, they rob trust.
You know, Greg, one thing that keeps coming up with these white-collar cases is how long the con lasts. Years, sometimes decades. How does something like that fly under the radar for so long?
That's a question we ask ourselves all the time in law enforcement. In Stanford's case, it was the combination of charm, control, and complexity. The average investor couldn't possibly understand the offshore maze of shell companies, certificates of deposit, or inflated returns. He banked on that confusion, and regulators didn't push hard enough until it was too late.
So what can everyday people learn from this? What's the red flag we miss until it's in flames?
First off, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Stanford promised steady double-digit returns on investments during a global financial crisis. That alone should have raised eyebrows. And second, transparency. If someone can't explain where your money is going in clear, understandable terms, walk away.
And for institutions, what does this tell us?
It tells us that international regulation needs teeth. You can't regulate only within U.S. borders anymore. Fraud doesn't respect geography. The Stanford case revealed gaping holes in how cross-border finance is monitored.
And then there's the human element. People want to believe. We want to trust, especially when the person shaking our hand is polished, successful, and throwing around money.
That's the tragedy of it. Stanford didn't just steal money, he stole belief. He weaponized optimism.
And when greed wears a tuxedo, it's easy to miss the knife in its hand. As we close out today's episode, I want to thank you all for taking the time to explore this case with us. Allen Stanford wasn't your typical criminal. He didn't storm into banks or break into safes. He shook hands, posed for photos, and passed as a man of status. But behind the tailored suits and polished charm was a master manipulator who left a financial graveyard in his wake.
That's right, Suada. This case reminds us that fraud doesn't need to be violent to be devastating. It wrecks homes, it destroys trust, and in Stanford's case, it reshaped how we think about offshore finance and regulatory gaps. The scars left behind, both emotional and financial, are very real.
And as always, the victims deserve to be remembered. Their lives were turned upside down for believing in something that, by all appearances, felt safe. But safety isn't in the pitch, it's in the proof. Greg, I can't thank you enough for joining me again. Your insight into these white-collar cases always adds depth and clarity, and I know our listeners appreciate it just as much as I do.
It's always a pleasure, Suada. Anytime.
And to all of you listening to this podcast or watching on YouTube, thank you. Whether you're a first-time listener or a returning crime file junkie, I'm grateful to have you on this journey with me. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss an episode. Next time on American Greed, we turn our attention to another case of deception, one involving contaminated medicine, regulatory failure, and a deadly outbreak. You won't want to miss it. I'm Suada Conzonire, and this has been American Greed. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and stay skeptical.